Alright, so I'm going to do a quick demonstration to show that validating this way is fine, but it's not entirely correct. Why is that? Take a look. What happens if, after validating the web opening, I come and, for example, want to open an Excel file? I'm also going to assign a result to this Excel file. I also have to validate this Excel file. Why is that? Because I'm the one saying, you have to open a file, Excel in this case, and return the result, in other words, whether it opened correctly or not. This result, if I have to validate this Excel file, why is that? Because I need to determine whether it opened correctly or not. That is, I'm going to tell this Excel to open a path, a route, a file, an Excel file. Thank you. And here I'm assigning that result, whether it opened correctly or not, to this variable. That is, it should return true or false depending on whether it opened correctly or not. And if that happens, I have to check it again. In other words, I have to use an if statement with a condition, and if that condition is met, determine a course of action. That is, some actions, some commands here inside. And if not, other commands go in the else. Notice that I'm chaining if statements here. This isn't exactly wrong, but it's not entirely correct either, and let's say it's not considered good practice. So, let's delete this, and I'm going to show you how to do this the right and efficient way. Okay, let's delete this and focus on the part about validating the open command, waiting for the object. Alright, once we have this, what we're going to do is call a new robot, for example, called valider.go. And here in the description, we're going to write, validates the actions executed in Google. Okay, let's create it. And automatically, we'll see the following. A new robot created from scratch based on the other one, from the parent. Alright. We're going to leave this robot just as it is. And now we come here and what we're going to do is, in the script, run or execute a robot from the beginning. In other words, run a robot from a database. In this case, let's go here. If we select, we can already see that valider Google is available. That is, I'm going to open the browser, wait for the object, and then I'm going to enter the child robot. In the child robot, what we mentioned earlier will happen, the validation of the if statement. But we're still dealing with the same thing. If I perform the validation, for example, I assign or set the variable to be used. What do I need to put in here? Well, if it opened correctly, then continue with the actions. That is, I need to put inside this if all the actions the bot should follow. That is, clicking on an object, extracting the text, and other related tasks. So, since I'm only going to use this robot for validation, let's do the following. We're going to perform the inverse validation. In other words, put a not in front of it. What does that mean? It means if it's not true or false, then execute what's in here. And if not, execute what's over here. But remember that I can leave the else block empty, whereas the if block cannot be left empty. So, if it's not true, in other words, if it's false, what am I going to do? I'm going to come here and close the browser, because that means the web page didn't open correctly. So, since it didn't open correctly, there's no point in continuing to run the robot, so in the script I go and use stop all and exit, which basically means stop everything and exit, and this completely stops the robot. So, I save, go to the main robot, and now I have this logic set up. That is, let's go step by step. I open the browser, wait for the object, and here This is exactly the validation, meaning if it runs correctly, it executes the else, but since it's empty, nothing will happen, so it will exit this robot. But if it doesn't run correctly, meaning the response is false, it will close the browser and stop everything and exit. Alright, so what will happen? Notice that when I called this variable, I didn't create it here. Why? Because Rockerbot works this way. I'm always going to have a parent robot and a child robot. It doesn't matter if we have a parent robot and then children of children of children. It doesn't matter. I'm always going to have a parent robot and a child robot. Now, since I'm using the variable res in the parent robot and I need the child robot to use it, that is, for the child robot to work with that variable, I don't create it in the child robot. Why? Because if I create it, for example, let's create it just as an example, this robot will take the information that's here, but it will take it starting from this robot. Notice that this robot doesn't perform any action related to validating the response. Therefore, this variable will remain empty. On the other hand, when I delete this, obviously, the child robot will take this variable. First, it will look for it here inside the variable section of the robot it's in, which would be the child robot in this case, and if it doesn't find it, it goes to the variable section of the parent robot, which in this case will find it and will have a response. So it's going to use that response to work with, well, it's not true, it's false, so it executes the else, but in this case the else can be left empty. So what it's going to do is not execute anything and just exit. If it exits, that means the execution was successful and I should continue with the robot steps. Alright, continuing with the robot's execution, we said that after opening the browser, what it should do is click here and perform a search. Let's do that, so we're going to select the element. Remember, right-click, copy, and we have copy XPath and copy full XPath. Well, let's see and understand what the difference is between one and the other, because they almost have the same name, but they're not the same. Let's copy the XPath and paste it here. Meanwhile, if we do the same, right-click and copy the full XPath, we'll put it down here so you can see it. Notice the difference between one and the other. This is the XPath and this is the full XPath. Alright. What's the difference between each one? Here it's very clear. The XPath generally works with the ID. The ID is basically the identifier of the element. That identifier can be fixed, meaning that it always stays the same for that element, or it can be variable. You have to check and determine that depending on the website. Sometimes websites are built in such a way that the ID stays fixed for some elements and for others it changes. That's where you have to see what you need to use. Whereas the full XPath is basically the location of that element. How can we, in some way, make a really clear example of this? Alright, let's do the following. Let's open Google Maps, but you might be wondering, what does this do? Open a new browser. Here, Google Maps. Alright, let's open Google Maps now. Alright. we're here, so I need to search for the city of Paris. I have two ways to search. Notice that there's one here. For example, I'm going to type Paris, France, and automatically we're going to go to the city of Paris. Right, it's going to take me there. I used a name, an ID, an identifier. Now, if I use the location, what is the location? It's actually the coordinates of Paris. Right, what's going to happen? It's going to pinpoint the city of Paris by coordinates, that is, by location. That's basically the difference between the expat and the full expat. The full expat works with location, that is, with coordinates, and the expat generally works with an identifier. Now, what's the difference between one and the other? In other words, when do I use one and when do I use the other? Well, if I'm sure that the location of the element doesn't change, meaning it always stays the same, you can use the full expat. But that's not always the case. In fact, it happens much less often than you might think. So basically, if I tell the robot to use the full expat, I'm telling it to look for an element that's in this spot, in this location. But maybe in the next run, that element changes its location. So, it won't find it anymore. Now, with expat, what happens is that it will look for the element that's called or has an ID, like whatever, in this case, it had some numbers and letters. Well, it's going to look for that element, and it doesn't matter if it's in one location or another, it'll find it. So that's the difference between one and the other, which is important to know. Now, I can't guarantee that using expat will always work for you, just like I can't guarantee that using full expat will always work either. It might work. It all depends on the website and which element you're working with. Okay, so let's select right-click. We're going to select expat in this case. Right-click, and then we go to Rockbot to perform the next action, which is clicking on the object. So let's paste-click on object. We paste it here. We indicate that it's an expat, and notice that the search bar isn't selected, but when I run this command, it will be selected so you can perform a search. Alright, so now what I'm going to do is basically tell it to search for the word, for example, rock, in the same expat. And we're going to hit enter. So notice that automatically, when I press here, the search will already be happening. See how fast that is? Alright, there it performs the search, and now we can see that the browser has the specified search results. Alright, now what we basically need to do is validate this page, because it could happen that it doesn't open correctly, right? It can happen. So let's select an element. And we're going to do the following. We're going to extract, copy the export. And we're basically going to indicate the same thing. Validate, let it exist or not exist. And do the same thing. Notice that by cloning, I'm validating. So, I don't need to do it all over again. The whole robot, since this robot already performs that validation. I just copy or clone the command, and that's it, automatically. I'm validating correctly. Alright, now take a look. Now I'm going to save. There's a step I skipped on purpose, and I want you to figure out what it is. Notice that the first command opens the Google browser, but with the second one, We don't know what it does. So, for that, we're going to fill in the corresponding information. So, it patiently waits for the specified object at the clearly indicated element, thereby ensuring proper synchronization. Here, we're going to put child robot that validates the action. First, locate and click on the search bar, which is typically found at the top or center of your screen. Next, carefully type the word rocket into the designated search field. Finally, to initiate your search, press the Enter key on your keyboard. And the same here, it performs the wait for the object at the clearly indicated element. Alright, now, please notice the significant difference between this particular robot and the previous one before we even consider adding the comments. Notice that now it is much more understandable. You can easily go into the robot's programming and fully comprehend what is precisely happening, what it is actually doing, and the detailed step-by-step process involved. So you can understand the process. See how quickly you can get comfortable with the robot now. Whereas before, when you first opened it, you probably couldn't understand anything, if the commands don't have comments. Alright, now what we need to do is proceed to extract the text that we specify. For example, we're going to select this text, extract its XPath, specify that it's an XPath, and we're going to save it in the variable texto. Notice that I haven't created it yet, so I'll create it now. We'll see here that it was created correctly, and if we drag and drop it, we bring it over to the web section so it's stored there. Then here we can see that it already extracted the specified text. Good. So, once I have the extracted text, what I basically need to do is tell this browser to close properly, stop everything, and exit. Now let's run this robot to see that it worked correctly. Alright, so to wrap up today's bot and see that what we've done runs perfectly and that we can create a robot in just a few minutes to perform a certain task, let's run the bot completely from this button. So we're going to click Run, and we can already see that the robot opens the Google browser, waits for the object, then types, hits Enter, and extracts the bot. The text we've specified so it can work with it. Alright, so once it extracts it, it closes everything and the robot has already run automatically. Well, that was today's class, the demonstration so you can see what we've accomplished, and I hope to see you in the next class.